I don't know. I'll tell you, I don't know what I'm thinking about myself. I, uh, I just sit here and wait
Well,
what comes around, or where do I go? It's I don't know. It's uh, it's something I don't like.
greetings, friends. I'm sad to announce the passing of my grandfather, Robert. He passed away on January 30th, a Thursday, sometime in the early evening. He was 108 years old. Robert featured on his channel. I'm not sure how many videos he appeared in off the top of my head, but it was probably between a dozen and 20 videos over the years, less frequently in recent years as his mental state deteriorated. You don't get to that age without dealing with some form of hearing loss, which he had severe, and near blindness, which he had from macular degeneration in the centers of the eye, the black part of your eye. For some years, probably up to 15, 20 years, he had macular degeneration. And then the third thing would be the mind. He'd have memory problems to the point where he wouldn't be able to remember much of anything at all. Everything would be like a new day. Like, where am I? Where is this room? Am I in Latvia? Am I in Canada? But despite dealing with that, he really wasn't ever hospitalized apart from a heart irregularity he had over a year ago. And even then, he wasn't even aware of having anything wrong with him. But other than that, like, he'd never been hospitalized for anything in his life. He never had any major disease that I know of. He smoked cigarettes his entire life with varying degrees of regularity. He didn't suffer in that degree. So I was thinking of the question of suffering. It's interesting because in some sense you're going to suffer. You live that long, you're going to suffer. You're also going to see all your loved ones and your friends pass away. He outlived his daughter, like our mother, who died only at 53 years old from cancer in 2007. He outlived his wife, our grandmother Carmen, who died only in her mid-70s in 1995. He suffered in that generic way, but when we think of the word suffering, we might think of misery, we might think of physical pain and agony. In that regard, I'm not so convinced that he really suffered. Well, he did fall down a lot in his final years. He must have had 20 spills where he went down, and remarkably didn't break bones, but did bruise himself all over numerous times. That must have hurt. So, yeah, maybe some pain. But he didn't really suffer in a miserable state. I never saw him make any exclamation of pain. I never heard him make any exclamation of despair, of a mental or emotional suffering. He always powered on. He always seemed to be upbeat, even though he could be severe at times and a bit cranky, for sure, but never really a miserable guy. So in that regard, he didn't actually suffer very much. And when it came to his final passing, he had been his normal self up until 2 weeks ago. Even despite relative ups and downs in his life, he always had a very vital presence. And for the first time, I noticed that it had gone down. He seemed subdued, seemed mentally subdued. About 2 weeks before his passing, in middle of January. Because I would go visit him every Saturday or Sunday, at least once a week when I had time on the weekends. Yeah, I mean, he'd fallen down before and maybe been subdued, but he would always come back. But this time I noticed, okay, he's really subdued. He didn't have the energy to get out of bed. I would take him in the wheelchair, and we'd go outside. I'd give him a cigarette or two. We'd go for a walk. We'd spend almost an hour outside. You know, I get him bundled up. If it's the wintertime or the summertime was nice, we'd go up the hill. We'd go maybe to High Park, various places, hopefully get some sun, get some fresh air, because there's not really anyone else at the assisted living home that would take him outside to do that. Although it was a good home and good people there, I do think they took as reasonably good care as they could of Robert, and everyone said they were touched by him. He made a positive impression on anyone he met. He just had a final decline in the last 2 weeks where he was just losing strength. He couldn't get out of bed that time that I first came and noticed. I mean, I got to get him out of bed so he can get in the wheelchair. He could still stand up. I mean, sometimes he'd go wandering around, but I guess at this point he's like going to have to stay in the bed. So I couldn't take him outside. And then the next weekend I came again and he was in the same subdued state. and he couldn't speak at this time. That was the one time that I did weep, and I'm glad that I had a chance to express that in the presence of my grandfather when he was still alive. And he actually was holding my hand extremely firmly. After some moments, I was ready to remove my hand, and it was difficult actually for me to withdraw my hand. So he was so tenacious a guy that he's lost the ability to speak now. His breathing was shallow, but still aware, still quite there. Despite your mind is going, he's still there. He never really sort of faded away the way other people kind of fade away. In that moment, he still had the strength to hold my hand that firmly, despite losing strength in other faculties. So that was very representative of the kind of guy Robert was. He was tenacious, he powered on, and when it came down to his final day, he still ate dinner. They fed him. They said he ate well. The lady who had been feeding him, she described him as a good eater. And then she left the room because there's not staff that can look after you all the time there. For that, you would need a long-term care home. He was only in level 2, like assisted living. Could probably use the long-term care home, of course. And someone checked on him again. Around 7:40 p.m., they found that he wasn't breathing. Now, he had been fed dinner around 5 o'clock. So sometime after that time, he just stopped breathing. I had actually taken some time off work the previous day to spend a few hours with him in the afternoon. So I'm glad I got to see him the day before he passed. Sadly, there wasn't anyone in the room with him when he actually passed. That's just the way it goes sometimes. I was lucky to be in the room with my father when my father passed away around the same time of the year, late January 2024. My mother actually passed away in late January 2007. I don't know what's up with January. It's a very dark, deep of winter, so I get it. It's not a great time of the year. And I'll probably have a video later where I'll have some clips of him, some selections. I don't know, he said different things. He said some things which I thought were funny for being politically incorrect.
Well, I thought that Ukraine was part of Russia. Ukraine is one province, and there is another province, and all that's Russia.
England has many Muslims from the Middle East, from Pakistan as well. It's
Pakistani.
It's
Why
true.
did they let them in?
He said some other more life wisdom sorts of things. He said interesting things.
Start your own independent life, where you have to earn your living, make your arrangements, and not just like in the common sense of earning living, also forming your life, thinking about that at some point one will get married, will form a family, will proceed through the long years of your age from situation to situation, but all connected in one sort of main line which goes right through your life, which is earning your living.
I don't know how I'll organize that, but I probably will at some point release some clips of Robert, some compilation or compilations. And I guess I can conclude by telling you a little bit more about his background. He was Latvian. He was born in the countryside of Latvia on October 29th, 1916. Technically at the time it was October 16th, but they had a calendar change that was implemented some years later, and his birthday became recognized as October 29th. So he grew up in Latvia on a farm. His father ran a mill. His father was from German stock that had migrated to Latvia. The family name had been Walker. They changed it to Volkers, more of a Latvian spelling, I guess. And I guess so his mother would have been Latvian. He grew up, of course, as Latvian, speaking Latvian, but he studied German and Russian in school and has fond memories just growing up on the farm as a kid, and to go to school was pretty far. He studies like the mechanical sciences, he studies engineering, mathematics, that kind of thing. He was always into science, engineering. That was his interest and his hobby and his career his whole life. So he studied, I guess, at the University of Riga, but I don't know too much about what he was doing in his 20s. He wasn't just like a fresh kid when World War II happened. And he was enlisted in the Latvian army in the beginning of the war, briefly, and then was discharged and went back to civilian life throughout most of the war. He finished his studies, I think, from the University of Riga in 1943. And then at some point he was recalled to the Latvian army. And at that point in World War II, things were going bad for Germany, which was the natural ally of Latvia. Robert was called back to fight, I guess, the Russians or the Soviets. The Soviets were winning. They were pushing back the Germans. And I don't know if he began in a regiment of just Latvians, but somehow as it went on, he ended up in a German company with only a few Latvians. And he was the radio guy. He was the guy in charge of the communications. And they were basically preparing to retreat. Many regiments or companies were permitted to evacuate from Latvia, from the Baltic coastline, in boats on their way to Germany. And the idea was that these boats would land in parts of Germany that would be occupied by the Americans or the British, because it would be better to be captured by those people than by the Soviets, because the Soviets might shoot you outright or put you in a prison camp. Robert was in the situation where he was lucky enough that his detachment was granted a spot on one of these evacuation boats. Of course, he had to leave behind his family and friends in Latvia, and this boat set out on the waters with other boats. I don't know how many other boats, but from what we hear, less than half of the boats made it to their destination. There were Soviet planes strafing them. Also, some of the boats were overcrowded with men, and some of them were taking on water, including the boat that my grandfather Robert was on. The boat was taking on water, it was overloaded, but somehow they made it to a part of Germany that was occupied by the British. The rest is history. So he could have easily not made it across. Probably many of his German and Latvian fellow soldiers didn't make it there, and he wasn't able to go back to Latvia. That was now definitely part of the Soviet Union for a long time to come. So he just had to totally start life anew in what ended up being a displaced persons camp in Germany. So I don't know, he wasn't kept in a separate camp with just the soldiers, but he ended up in a displaced persons camp, and then after that specifically a camp for Latvians. And that's where he met my grandmother Carmen. And I don't know if they got married right away, but that's where he learned English in the camp. He started studying English, and I guess he taught math as a tutor for other people. And at some point after a few years, I think 1947, around that time, they were granted passage to England, and he lived in, was it Leicester or Leeds? It was one of those places. He worked in a factory, of course, then was informed from Latvian friends who had immigrated to Canada that there were good opportunities in Canada for work. And he knew this couple, they were friends of the family for many years, and they were in Montreal, so they helped encourage them to come to Canada. They were granted. So for whatever reason, maybe the US didn't grant them, so the Canada did. So my grandpa took his wife and my mother, who had been born in England in 1953, I believe. When she was only a toddler, they went to Canada, they came to Montreal, they got established in Montreal. That's where my mother grew up, in the English part of Montreal. And my grandfather soon got a job at Redpath Sugar and rose to become manager of the factory of Redpath Sugar. I'm not sure exactly in Montreal. He came to Toronto later to manage the factory in downtown Toronto, the Redpath Sugar Refinery, which still exists today. Now, I don't say he was like an administrator or in management, but my understanding is that he was the factory manager. So, and he was an engineer. Like, he did have to solve engineering problems, although that's beyond me. I'm not able to talk about that. So work occupied his life. All of his passion was in his work. And he didn't understand the concept of hanging out with friends, as I featured in one of my videos before. Although he did have friends, of course. He had family and he cared about people and people cared about him. But for his time and place, it was all about work. Work was the source of meaning, And I guess that's kind of a Protestant work ethic. He didn't come from a religious background. From what I understand, Latvia was not really a religious place in that sense. It wasn't an Orthodox country. It was nominally Lutheran, but it doesn't seem like he ever absorbed much of traditional Christianity at all.
Did my father or mother
Believe in God that of Christianity? Like, did they believe in
Yes,
Jesus Christ?
Yes, I think they did, but sort of not intensively. When we lived in my country, everyone seems to, to believe in God and so on, but also their personal actions and so on cannot be tied to anything.
I knew that he believed in God because I asked him a few times, and I knew that he wasn't afraid of death because he told me that specifically he wasn't afraid of death when I asked him that question numerous times over the years. Without hesitation, he said, "No, I'm not afraid of death." But he wasn't exactly a religious person. And because there's no church he was a member of or religious community and has really many relatives here, it's just myself and another person, his grandchildren. We're not able to really have a funeral for Robert here because it wouldn't really make sense. There wouldn't be, but we might have a memorial gathering. If he had passed away in Latvia, then they would have had a funeral. It would have made sense. And you outlive everyone too, so there's no one left who knew you directly except for a few people to have the funeral. You outlived everyone who would have had the funeral. So yeah, I'm sort of getting distracted, but he works for Red Path Sugar for his whole career, managing the technical functioning of the factory, like solving any problem, I guess, that would arise with the machinery. By the early 80s, he was certainly retired. Let's say he's working from the late 50s, at least from the early 60s. That's about, 20 years or more? I think it was 57 when they came. So that's only, assuming he starts working at Red Path Sugar right away, that's only about 23 years till you get to 1980 when he retires, which is amazing. That's incredible. So he was being retired since the early 80s. So that would suggest to me that he's being retired longer than he worked, at least in his career at Red Path Sugar. He's been retired for 45 years, practically, and collected a pension from Red Path Sugar for all of that time. Whereas had worked at Red Path Sugar for a maximum of 21, 22 years probably. Imagine that today. Of course, he worked previously before he came to Canada, but for collecting that pension from Red Path Sugar, unbelievable. He wasn't able to go back to Latvia until the early 90s when the Soviet Union fell, and then he did go, and he brought our mother with him, and that was her first time visiting, and they spent some weeks there. And he always maintained contact with his relatives there. But after my mother passed away in 2007, he'd been living with us in the house in Etobicoke with my dad, his two grandchildren. Once my mom was gone, he didn't want to remain in the house. He wanted to be back in Latvia where some of his female relatives could take care of him. Because he's of the mind that there has to be a woman in the house, cooking and being the queen of the house. That was the way he looked at it. And I understand. So he had that situation in Latvia. So he arranged to go back to Latvia. And he was in Latvia one more time in his life from 2008 to 2016, 8 or 9 years. Back in Latvia after a half century of never being able to go there because it was closed off. It was the Soviet Union. Of course, he did visit in the early 90s once or twice. And then a short visit again before he decided to go back there permanently. And he was, and of course made that move in 2008. He came to live with us. My mom at the time had said, well, we didn't think he would live that long. I mean, she died in 2007, so he outlived her. My dad died at 79. He's always been this guy that existed on the edge, this guy who has no fear of death. And you always think he's going to be entering the next world, but he never does. And he just gets older and older and older. And so it was kind of surreal when he actually did pass. And I guess it was a benefit for me to be around someone like that because I was able to live with him for 10 years, 1998 to 2008. And then again, when he comes back to Canada in 2016, And the reason for him coming back was that it had gotten to the state where it was more difficult for the family in Latvia to take care of him, and he had to go to a home, like a facility, whether in Latvia or in Canada. And we decided that the services would be better in Canada. He came back to Canada in 2016. It was the beginning of June, very end of May. He arrived in Canada, and I hadn't seen him in like almost a decade. And he had declined further, but was still the same guy. And he lived in Mississauga in a retirement home there for over 7 years until he no longer had the necessary help there. And then he came to live in a different home, an assisted living facility. Really, like I said, he could have used long-term care eventually, but we got him to an assisted living facility. And this stuff is incredibly expensive. But luckily, he had the money accumulated over the years to pay for it. And that was where he finished his days, in this assisted living near Hyde Park in Toronto, which is good because that was closer to where I lived, so I could visit him more easily. So it was a blessing to be around Robert, exactly 70 years older than me, because I'm born in 1986, he's born in 1916, like he's literally born during the First World War. And he always told me, work in a factory. I always thought, oh, Grandpa, we've deindustrialized and I can't work in a factory because I'm a spoiled millennial who doesn't want to do real manual labor. And then I realized that he had a point later on. I realized he had a point. And he always said, get married, of course. He would always say that. Get married, get a job, whatever job, any job. Work your way up. We can discuss later how easy that is these days. But it was a positive message. When we asked him, my friend and I, how do you live many years, Robert? He said, well, you have to adjust to your situation. He said that in August of 2024, about half a year ago, my friend had come to visit him. I'm glad he got to see him. We were outside on a summer afternoon. My grandpa had a cigarette. There's some photos from there. I'll include some of those photos. By that time, my grandpa looked so small, looked so tiny compared to how he used to look. But yeah, he was still like quite lucid enough that in that moment, he could give you an answer. It wouldn't be like a normal conversation that could continue on the same train of thought. But in that moment, hey, Grandpa, how do you live many years? Well, you have to adjust to your situation. That's what he said. And certainly he adjusted and adapted many times over his life. Hasta luego, amigos. Do you want to wish anyone a Happy New Year?
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
first to you.
Well, thank you. Okay.
Very, very big or deep happiness.
Thank you.
I wish you. And especially happiness where women are concerned.